Section number 10 of Essays on Art. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Essays on Art by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, translated by Samuel Gray Ward, section number 10. My brother-in-law was a well-looking man, of prudent conduct in the affairs of life. His talent satisfied my father, his love my sister, his friendliness attached me and the rest of the household. During the summer he traveled and always came back well paid for his labors. The winters he devoted to his family. He painted his wife and daughters, usually twice in the year. The fidelity, bordering on deception, with which he represented even the merest trifles, caused my father to fall upon a singular idea, the execution of which I must describe to you. The picture itself, as will presently appear, is no longer in existence. Otherwise, I should have shown it to you. In the upper chamber, the last one of the range, where the best portraits hang, you may have noticed a door which seems to lead further on. But in fact, it is a blind door, and when it was opened, the spectator encountered a scene more surprising than agreeable. My father, with my mother on his arm, seemed to be stepping forward to meet you, and startled you by the reality of the representation, which was effected partly by the surrounding objects, partly by the art of the painter. He was represented as if returning home from a dinner party, dressed as was his wont on such occasions. The picture was painted with the greatest care, on the spot and for that particular place. The figures from a certain point of view were perfectly in perspective, and the effect of the dresses must carefully worked up. A window had to be displaced in order that the light might fall properly from the side, so that nothing should break the illusion. It was the unfortunate destiny of this work, which had thus been made to approach as near as possible to reality, to share the fate of its originals. The frame, with the canvas, was set into the casing of the door, and thus exposed to the influence of a damp wall, the effect of which was increased by the air being excluded by the door, and, at the end of a hard winter, during which the room had not been opened, father and mother were found to be utterly destroyed, which was the more to be deplored as they were no longer living. I must go back a little in order to speak of the last satisfaction my father enjoyed during his life. After his idea had been wrought out in this picture, it seemed as if art had no farther gratification in store for him. Yet one was still vouchsafed for him. An artist was announced who undertook to mold likeness in plaster upon the face, and afterwards to copy them in wax with the colors of life. The likeness of a young assistant he had with him bore witness to his talent, and my father determined to submit to the operation. The experiment was successful. The artist elaborated the face and hands with the greatest care and truth. A real wig, a damask dressing gown, were appropriated to the phantom, and there sits the good old man yet, behind a curtain, which I had not the courage to withdraw for you. After the death of the old people, we did not long remain together. My sister died, still young and beautiful. Her husband painted her in her coffin. His grief at her loss would never permit him to paint his daughters, who, as they grew up, seemed to inherit their mother's beauty, as if divided into two portions. He often made little pictures in still life of the various articles that had belonged to her, and which he had carefully preserved. He worked them up with the greatest care and presented them to the friends he had made during his travels. It seemed as if his grief raised him to the ideal, for previously he had only represented present objects. These little mute pictures were not wanting either in keeping or expression. In one, the objects grouped together showed the pious spirit of their possessor, a hymn book with red cover and golden studs, a pretty embroidered purse with strings and tassels that she used to dispense her charities from, the goblet from which before her death she partook the sacrament, and which he had procured by presenting a better to the church. In another picture was a loaf, and beside it the knife she used to cut slices with for the children, the little seed box from which she sowed seeds in the spring, a calendar where she set down her expenditures and any little occurrences, a glass goblet with her initials cut upon it, a youthful gift from her grandfather that, in spite of its fragility, had outlasted its owner. He recommended his journeys and his usual course of life, skillful only to see the present, and by the present always reminded of his irreparable loss. His spirit could not recover its tone. A sort of incomprehensible longing seemed often to take possession of him, and the last still life that he painted consisted of objects which had belonged to her, and which, curiously chosen and grouped, hinted at transitoriness and separation, at permanence and reunion. We found him several times before this picture, pausing and reflecting contrary to his wont, moved and agitated, and you must pardon me if I here break off short for today to recover my composure, which this recollection, which I dare no longer indulge in, has unexpectedly disturbed. Yet my letter must not go to you with so sorrowful an ending, and I give the pen to my Julia to say to you, my uncle gives me the pen, with the injunction to give a graceful turn to the expression of his devotedness to you. He continues true to that custom of the good old time, when it was the fashion to close a letter, to part from one's friend, with a well-bred bow. We young people have never learnt it. Such a formality does not seem to us natural nor hearty enough. We cannot get beyond a farewell and in an imaginary pressure of hand. What is to be done now to fulfill this commission, this injunction of my uncle, as beseems an obedient niece? Cannot I stumble upon some graceful turn, and will it be graceful enough if I assure you that the nieces are no less your devoted than the uncle? He has forbidden me to read his last sheet. I wonder what good or ill he has been saying of me. Perhaps it is only my vanity makes me think he had made any mention of me. It is enough that he has let me read the first page of his letter, and there I find he has been decrying our good philosopher to you. It is neither pretty nor proper of my uncle to take so severely to task a young man who has so high a love and respect both for him and you, merely because he so earnestly pursues a path which he thinks will tend to his improvement. Be candid with me now, and say if you do not think that we women often see clearer than men, for the reason that we are not so one-sided and concede to everyone what belongs to him. In fact, the young man is courteous and companionable. Sometimes he talks to me, and though I do not understand his philosophy, methinks I understand the philosopher. Yet, after all, perhaps he is indebted to you for the good opinion I have of him, since the roll of engravings which he brought from you, accompanied by your friendly message, secured him the best reception. I am somewhat puzzled how to express my thanks for your remembrance and your goodness, inasmuch as there seems to me to be a little wickedness concealed under your gift. Did you mean to mock your handmaiden by sending these elfin air shapes, these strange forms of fairies and spirits, from the hand of my friend Fuseli? How can your poor Julia help it if she is charmed by the strange and wild, if she delights to see representations of the wonderful, and if it is a pleasure to her to see these dreams that seems to follow on and move through one another fixed upon paper? Nevertheless, you have procured me a great pleasure, though I am aware that with a second uncle comes a second rod, as if the first did not give me enough to do. For he can never let the children alone without enlightening them on the subject of their own likes and dislikes. Against this dictation my sister makes better stand than I, for she never suffers herself to be opposed, and the love of art in some shape being in our family a matter of course, her preference is for the agreeable and graceful, such forms as we would be glad always to have around us. Her lover, for the affair which was in a state of uncertainty at the time of your journey is now settled, has sent her from England some splendid colored prints that delight her beyond measure. But to be sure, what a set of tall figures all clad in white, with ribbons of pale red and veils of pale blue! What interesting mothers with well-fed children and personable fathers! When they are all nicely framed in glass and mahogany, adorned with the brass rods which came with the prints, and hung on a lilac ground in my young lady's cabinet, then indeed I shall not dare to bring Titania and her fairy court, and their charge, the metamorphosed Nick Bottom, into such company. Now, this looks as if I meant to criticize my sister, and in fact, there is no better way to be satisfied with one's self than to be a little intolerant of others. And now, at last, I have finished this sheet, and find myself unexpectedly so near the end of the paper that there is only room for the 10th day of March, and the name of your true friend, who bids you hearty farewell, Julia. End of section 10. Section 11 of Essays on Art. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Essays on Art by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Translated by Samuel Gray Ward. Section number 11. Letter 3. I observe that Julia, in her last postscript, has spoken a good word for the philosopher, but I am sorry to say her uncle cannot agree with her. For the young man not only holds by a method of his own, which I by no means enter into, but his mind is turned to objects concerning which I neither think nor even have thought. In the midst of my collection even, where I can soon find common ground with all men, I can find no point of contact with him. He has lost even the historical and antiquarian interest which he once seemed to have in it. Moral philosophy is his great study, of which I know but little beyond what my heart tells me. The law of nature I never feel the want of, because our administration of justice is righteous and our police active, but it is his next great attraction. The laws of nations that in my earliest youth my uncle had taught us to despise stands as the great aim of his studies. It is all up with the intercourse from which I promised myself so much pleasure. I can prize him as an excellent man, love him for his goodness, and am glad to serve him as my relation. But alas, we have nothing to say to each other. Before my engravings he is dumb, he sees my pictures unmoved. But while I am giving vent to my spleen to you, like a true uncle in the German comedy, experience draws me back and whispers that it is not the way to bind ourselves to men, to exaggerate those peculiarities which we chance to be separated from them. Let us therefore rather wait and see what the future has in store for us, and I will not neglect my duty towards you, but go on with my account of the founders of my collection. My father's brother, after having acquired credit as a brave officer, was employed in various affairs of state from time to time, and finally in very important matters. He was antiquated with most of the princes of his time, and from receiving presents adorned with their likeness in enamel and miniature, he acquired a connoisseurship in works of this class. He procured by degrees the likeness of dead as well as living potenents, by searching for such golden snuff boxes and diamond settings as had found their way back to the goldsmiths and jewelers, and so at last had, in these likenesses, a complete royal calendar of his century. As he traveled much, he wished to keep his treasure at hand, and was able to bring it within very small compass. He never exhibited it without its being increased by the addition of some living or dead prince, from one jewel box to another, for a regular connection has the property of attracting all waifs and strays, and even the affection of the possessor towards some isolated treasure is annihilated and disappears through the attraction of the mass. From portraits, among which occurred full-length figures, such, for instance, as princesses, allegorically represented as nymphs or huntresses, he afterwards extended his collection to other small pictures of the same sort, always looking more to the exquisite finish of the execution than to the high ends of art, which are, however, by no means foreign to this style of painting. I observe you to admire the masterpieces of this collection. My additions to it have only few and occasional. And now at last I have to speak of myself, the complacent professor of this well-known and highly praised collection, often enough to its vexed and annoyed guardian. My inclinations were, from my youth, the opposite of the tastes of my uncle and my father. Whether it was that the more earnest aim of my grandfather had fallen to me by inheritance, or, as children often do, I had, out of the spirit of opposition, left the ways of my father and uncle with conscious perversiveness, I will not pretend to decide. It suffices to say that while the former wished that art should be made by means of the closest imitations and the most scrupulous execution to follow exactly in the steps of nature, and the latter prized pictures only so far as they were divided to infinity by the most delicate strokes of the pencil, so that he always kept a magnifying glass at hand, in order to increase the wonder of the work, I, on the other hand, could find satisfaction in no other sort of works of art but sketches, which presented to my mind a lively image of some work yet to be carried out. The admirable examples of this sort that I found in my grandfather's collection, and which might have shown me that a sketch can be made with as much accuracy as spirit, served to kindle my enthusiasm without guiding it. Boldly drawn, powerful sketches, roughly washed in with ink, these were what delighted me, and even where a few dashing lines gave only the hieroglyphic of a figure, I knew how to interpret them, and prized such works beyond measure. With such was laid the foundation of the collection, which I began in my youth, and continued in riper years. In this wise I maintained a constant opposition with my father, my uncle, and my brother-in-law, and as neither of them knew how to approach my point of view or draw me to theirs, I became fixed and strengthened in my position. Although, as I have said, I prized a spirited sketch before all things, yet many finished works naturally found their way to my collection. I learned, without being aware of it, to prize the successful carrying out of a spirited sketch to a spirited completion. I learned to prize precision, although I made it to an indispensable condition that feeling should be commensurate with it. This direction was aided by the etchings of various Italian masters, which still remain in my collection. And thus I was going on in the right way when another inclination drew me back again. Order and completeness were the two qualities that I desired my little collection to possess. I read the history of art. I placed my prints in order, according to schools, masters, and years. I made catalogues, and must say in my own praise that I never learned the names of any good master, or became acquainted with the circumstance of any worthy artist, without looking about to purchase one of his works, so that I might not only be able to speak of his merit, but have a proof of it visible at hand. Thus it stood with my collection, my acquirements, and their direction, when the time came for me to enter the academy. My attachment to my profession, which was to be medicine, the absence of all works of art, new objects, a new life, forced back my love of art into the depths of my heart, and I only found occasion to practice my eyes upon whatever possessed the highest merit among the representations of objects of anatomy, physiology, and natural history. Yet before the end of my academical career, I found an opportunity to visit Dresden, which opened a new prospect for me, and one that had its effect on my whole life. With what delight, nay, with what intoxication, did I wander through the sanctuary of the gallery. How many presentiments were there realized! How many a chasm in my historical knowledge were filled up! How did my view enlarge itself over the steps of the temple of art! I looked back with self-congratulation on the family collection, which was one day to be mine, and the recollection was accompanied with the most delightful feelings. And since I could not be an artist, I should have been in despair if I had not from my birth been destined for an amateur and a collector. I will not detain you to relate the effect produced upon me by other collections, what besides I have done to add to the knowledge I before possessed, how my love of art has kept pace with all my other occupations and accompanied me like a guardian angel. I will only say that I turned all my remaining faculties to my profession and its exercise, that my practice soon required all my attention, and that my heterogeneous occupation seemed to only add to my love of art and my passion for collecting. What remains you will easily divine from your knowledge of me and my collections. When my father died and this treasure came into my possession, I had sufficient knowledge to fill up the chasms I found, not merely as a collector, because they were chasms, but rather in some sort as a connoisseur, because they were worthy of being filled. And it strengthens my conviction that I am in the right path, to find that my tastes correspond with the judgment of many sensible men with whom I have become acquainted. I have never been in Italy, but yet I have tried to make my taste, as far as possible, universal. How far I have succeeded you are fully able to judge. I will not deny that I might and should have cultivated a purer taste in this or that particular direction, but who could live with thoroughly purified inclinations? For the present and forever I have done with myself. Would that all my egotism could find vent in my collection. For the rest, let to give and to receive be the watchword between us, which can be spoken by no other with greater affection and confidence than by your truly devoted. End of section 11.